This will be the first of two videos I'm going to do on political philosophy in the 1900s. This one will be about analytical political philosophy, and the second will be on continental political and social philosophy. As I discussed in a previous video, analytical and continental philosophies differ in their approaches to all philosophical questions. Analytical philosophy is the approach that the emphasis is on analysis of terms, analysis of concepts, using logic that will lead us to positive, certain truth. The continental approach is to look at processes that are evident within history and understand those processes, and so we can respond to those processes with ways to better our world. The analytical approach to political philosophy, thus, is first and foremost an approach that looks for positive truths within an analysis of terms and concepts. It assumes, as its foundational assumption, that once we understand the logical structures, we can then understand the world and how people function within the world. In general, positivist philosophy is in opposition to what it sees as superstitious tradition, and therefore analytical political philosophers have adopted the term liberalism to mean that they are liberating us from superstitious old-fashioned ideas, such as the divine right of kings, etc., that we see in the medieval and classical periods. When they say liberalism, they do not mean liberal as we have come to mean and understand in our society today. It is not about progressive politics. It is not liberal in the sense of liberating groups based on race, gender, economic equality, any of those things. Analytical liberalism, because it has a very different approach from continental philosophy, has come up with a very different definition of what liberty and equality mean. The analytical ideal is a rational idea of liberty or freedom that may or may not include the idea of human rights and does not include an idea of social equality. There are a number of liberal analytical political philosophers, but first and foremost we need to discuss the most famous of them all, and that would be the American John Rawls. Rawls is very influential in analytical political philosophy because of his classic book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971. In that book, Rawls is trying to answer the question of what is justice, a question that's as old as Plato. Rawls's answer is that justice is fairness. Rawls believed that the common view that freedom and equality are in conflict is an illusion. He believed that freedom and equality are integrated into unity when we see justice as his definition of what fairness means. He demonstrates his answer through a thought experiment. Rawls asks us to imagine a world before society. This is similar to Hobbes and Locke's states of nature. Rawls asks us to imagine a state where there is no social institutions and no one is ranked in terms of social status, unlike Hobbes and Locke. Rawls is offering a hypothetical scenario that is grounded in pure logic, not the natural world. And so Rawls asks us to imagine this original scenario in which we are behind the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is a very significant concept for Rawls because he says we are in this state, this imaginary state before society has been constructed. And we need to deliberate amongst ourselves as to what type of society we will want. The catch, of course, is because we are behind the veil of ignorance, we do not know, once society is created, what gender, race, age, intelligence, wealth, skills, education, religion, and anything else that we will possess once we are a person within society. So whatever we decide in terms of our structure of society, we will be stuck with that, and we will be placed randomly within that social structure. So again, this is a thought experiment of pure logic. What matters here is only what we think makes sense, what appeals to our reason. So Rawls says that, well, logically, if we do not know what position we will have within a society, then logically, we would not choose any political or economic structure that would deny justice and the pursuit of the good life to anyone. Because Rawls says it would be totally irrational for us to agree to a society in which certain people are denied justice. Justice would be absolutely guaranteed to everyone. That's the society that logically we would want to live in. And he pins all of this on this sense of a Burkean or Smithian sense of self-interest. Because we have self-interest, it would be utterly illogical for anyone to agree on a society that allows any discrimination based upon, well, anything, race, gender, social status, what have you. We would then logically choose a society that guarantees equal justice for everyone. Rawls says that's the only logical choice. So Rawls' purpose in giving us this thought experiment is to clarify our thinking, to let us see the concepts underneath social structure. What is the logical heart of what justice means? And for him, justice means this type of equality. So for Rawls, justice means agreeing to a society that has adequate structures to ensure basic rights and freedom for all that can never be taken away based upon gender, race, age, or any other property that a person could possess. Nothing would entitle anyone to have more rights than those without a certain property that they could possess. A just society for Rawls, then, would be one that is based solely on a rational interpretation of this idea of the good without regard to hierarchical divisions. In the 50 years since, there has been much discussion about his idea, and he has both his defenders and his critics. And not surprisingly, much of the division about Rawls's philosophy goes on the lines of the analytical and continental divide. Analytical philosophers, even if they criticize certain elements of Rawls' idea, agree with the basic approach, because of course it is an analytical approach. And Rawls quite accurately describes his thought experiment as an engagement in ideal theory. It's saying, what would the ideal world be like? What should it be like? Well, logically, it should be this. That's the ideal. We reason from idealized assumptions about rational norms, and from those norms, we build the best possible social structure. Now, ideal theory, by design, by definition, does not attempt to address real-world problems. It seeks instead to establish the foundational rational principles. And this is an approach similar to Plato, similar to Hobbes, similar to a number of other philosophers throughout history, and of course very compatible with the analytical tradition. We work from first principles, logical, rational first principles, to this is how things should be. Not surprisingly, continental philosophers tend to disagree with this approach because it does ignore the real world. Philosophers like Amartya Sen and Charles W. Mills have pointed out it ignores the reality of existing inequality. It ignores the structures that perpetuate inequality. What use is it, this ideal theory? That doesn't mean that they're completely throwing it out. They're pointing out that there are flaws in this. We do need to have a discussion of what do we really mean by justice. But again, that's an argument that has been going on since Plato. And it's not like Rawls has solved the issue. Mills thinks that Rawls does provide us with some good ways to think about justice and equality, but that Rawls's theory is completely impotent and unfit to deal with racial justice. But on the side of the analytical approach, of people who like Rawls's approach, the most prominent and notable is Robert Nozick. Nozick followed up Rawls's book with his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia in 1974. Nozick adopts ideal theory, but he has some sharp disagreements with Rawls. Nozick agrees with the notion of justice, but not with Rawls's definition of equality. Nozick objected to Rawls's idea that justice should consider the well-being of those who are worse off. Rawls had argued that lifting up those who are worse off benefits everyone in society. Nozick counters that no, those who are well off have no obligation and no interest in assisting others for the sake of bettering society. Nozick instead bases his argument simply on the notion of justice, the logical, rational concept of justice. And justice is, in Nozick's mind, the idea of absolute, inviolable, natural rights for individuals. From this, Nozick states that an individual can and should be allowed to do whatever he wants as long as he respects the rights of others. But of course, what respect means for Nozick is the respect for the right to positive freedom, for the individual to do whatever he wants. And I do use the gender exclusive here with a reason in discussing Nozick. Nozick makes the extraordinary claim that any behavior is allowed as long as compensation is paid for any damage you cause to others. So if you driving your sports car down the road and you hit some little kid, justice is served in Nozick's analytical political world by simply paying whatever society has dictated is the amount that is compensation, just compensation for killing your child. Critics have naturally pointed out that such a view favors the rich people, those who have greater financial resources. Others have pointed out that Nozick is really just defending a kind of status quo in which the structures of economic inequality are not only perpetuated, but justified. The rich can do whatever they want because they have this inviolable right to do whatever they want. And Nozick would reply, and his followers, which are many, would reply that, well, yes, of course, and the poor people have the right to do whatever they want. But of course, it's that notion that justice then becomes a matter of compensation, which some will have the ability to perform, but others will not. And so this is the anarchy within the title of Nozick's books, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Anarchy is anyone gets to do whatever they want, and the purpose of the state is only, and I emphasize only, there to protect and defend the rights of individuals to do whatever they want. And thus we will reach utopia. In Nozick's ideal theory, utopia is a state that he calls minarchist, a government that has only the minimal powers necessary to enforce the law on behalf of individuals whose rights have been violated. A state is preferable to a pure anarchy in that it can protect individual rights, which in Nozick's vision of a utopia is mainly property and financial rights. Nozick gets that idea from John Locke, John Locke's labor theory of property, which many critics have pointed out over the centuries very much favors those who, well, have property already. Because if you say, well, I have property, I must have acquired it through my own labor. And Nozick completely buys that assumption. Nozick says the acquisition of property creates an inviolable right of the individual to do whatever he or she wants with that property. So if you had enough money to buy a sports car, you can drive that sports car anywhere you want, at whatever speed you want, however recklessly you want. That's your right. And so the acquisition of property is also an inviolable right. And Nozick offers no means to correct abuses of property acquisition, only a rather vague suggestion that such abuses are wrong. But of course they wouldn't happen in an ideal society because everyone is so deliriously happy in this utopian minarchist anarchy state. Throughout his philosophy, Nozick favors the assumption that those who are well off acquire their property justly and are thus justified in their wealth. Nozick therefore rejects any suggestion that the role of government should be for the welfare of the people. Nozick equates taxation with theft, and he is against any non-governmental efforts to promote greater social equality and justice. Nozick's 1974 book has become the foundation of a number of conservative political ideologies, for example, libertarianism, anarchic capitalism, and other forms of anarchic or minarchic political theories, including some theories that say that Nozick has a very good idea, but that even the idea of a minarchist state as being preferable to anarchy is wrong. Nozick doesn't go far enough, that we should have complete anarchy, kind of a might makes right society, because the state inherently is evil. Now, on that point that the state is evil, you will find agreement from the analytical Marxists. Analytical Marxism is similar to liberalism, as we've seen in Rawls and Nozick, in its analytical approach. But because analytical Marxism takes as its foundational logical, rational assumptions about the nature of reality from a scientific analytical interpretation of Marx, it, of course, comes to different conclusions than the liberal traditions in analytical political philosophy. Perhaps the foremost analytical Marxist was the French philosopher Louis Althusser. He divided Marxist philosophy into two time periods. The earlier humanist Marx, who wrote about human alienation, and the later scientific Marx, who wrote about structures of capital. There is some basis for Althusser's division here. However, Althusser completely dismissed Marx's early works as being delusional. He insisted instead on an absolute analytical, structuralist interpretation of Marxist philosophy. Althusser saw capitalist society in terms of a totality, with the structure of capitalist state being the social totality that dominates all human life. Therefore, in Althusser's mind, ironically very similar to Nozick's mind, the state is the enemy. The state needs to be destroyed. It cannot be reformed. Althusser thought that what Marx had identified as economic determinism was the first level of social totality, and what Marx had identified as the ideological superstructure of the state and culture as the second level of the totality. And thus Althusser places more importance on the role of state ideology as forming people into concrete subjects, filling concrete roles within that totality. And thus he saw the structure of ideology as completely unchanging throughout history. From this, Althusser says there is no individual. The idea of alienation in early Marx is a delusion because it is impossible for a person to be an individual within the totality of economic determinism and state ideology. There is only the totalizing theory of the ideological structure. From the analytical foundational concepts of Althusser's totalizing theory, a fairly substantial number of analytical Marxist philosophers have attempted to revise or extend the idea that fundamentally there is no hope of reforming our current society. Political philosophy thus has a role only in showing how the state is inherently ideological and totalizing that removes all possibility for human freedom. Some analytical Marxists, for example, G.A. Cohen, has brought in rational choice theory, which is an analytical theory in economics that states that people make rational cost-benefit calculations to determine what economic options are best for them. Again, this is an analytical approach of this is what logic dictates people should do. People are inherently logical. Therefore, this is what people do. Cohen's application of rational choice theory to Marxism is to explain the changes in economic epochs, why new modes of production sprang up, and thus human history is thus explained as a series of rational steps to increase economic productivity. And this is similar to various other analytical Marxist philosophers, that you bring in this or that rationalist analytical element to the totalizing picture that scientific Marxism and analytical Marxism claims that Marx was really meaning all along. What we end up with on the analytical political philosophy side of philosophy in general is two camps that will disagree on some fundamental issues about the economy, but they fundamentally agree that the real problem is the state, and that the real solution is to eliminate the state and replace it with some sort of utopia. Nozick's utopia, Rawls's utopia, and Althusser's utopias are very different, but they really come from the same place. And they are what happen when you really don't care about what's going on in the world.